The Old Man's Secret. When Lila moved to the small town of Ashford, she expected nothing more than a quiet life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The town was charming, with its cobblestone streets, old-fashioned shops, and the scent of pine trees that filled the air. The people were friendly enough, but there was something about Ashford that felt off. It was as though the town carried a weight of forgotten memories, buried deep within its history. Lila rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, its ivy-covered walls and creaky floors giving it an old-world charm. It was the perfect place for a fresh start. She spent her days exploring the surrounding woods, reading in the cozy nook by the window, and getting to know the locals. Among them was Mr. Harold, an elderly man who lived in a dilapidated house near the edge of the town. He was a quiet man, always seen walking slowly down the street with his cane, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. Despite his frailty, there was something about him that intrigued Lila. One day, as Lila was walking through the town square, she noticed Mr. Harold sitting on a bench, his hands clasped together as he stared at the ground. She approached him, offering a friendly smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harold. How are you today?" He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. Miss Lila," he said in a gravelly voice. "I'm well, I suppose. Just thinking about things." "Things?" Lila asked, curious. "Things that have been buried," he replied cryptically, his gaze drifting to the old church at the center of town. "Things that should have stayed buried." Lila didn't press him further, but the conversation lingered in her mind. There was a strange air about Mr. Harold, as though he was carrying a burden, one that he was too afraid to share. Over the next few weeks, Lila began visiting him regularly, bringing him food and chatting about her life in Ashford. The more time she spent with him, the more she noticed how reclusive he was. He never left his house after dark, and he seemed to have an aversion to certain places in town, especially the church and the woods. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila visited Mr. Harold's home again. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a moment's hesitation, she pushed the door open, the creaking hinges sounding louder than usual. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a single candle flickering on the mantel. Lila called out to him, but there was no response. She stepped further inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Harold?" she called again, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed from the back of the house. Lila froze, her blood running cold. It sounded like a groan, like someone in pain. She followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The house was colder than usual, and the air felt thick, as if something was suffocating it. She reached the door to the basement and found it ajar. The groaning was louder now, almost like a whisper, beckoning her inside. With a mix of fear and curiosity, Lila descended the stairs. The basement was dimly lit, the shadows dancing on the walls. In the far corner, she saw Mr. Harold, his frail body hunched over a large, covered object. His hands trembled as he slowly lifted the cloth, revealing what lay beneath. Lila gasped, her heart racing in her chest. The object was a coffin, old and weathered, its wood darkened with age. But it wasn't the coffin itself that terrified her. It was the figure inside. A woman, pale and lifeless, lay within. Her skin was ashen, her eyes wide open in a permanent frozen stare. Her mouth was slightly open as if she had been screaming when she died. The woman's hands were clasped tightly around a small rusted key. Lila stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Harold turned to face her, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful regret. "This is my secret," he said, his voice shaky. The woman in the coffin, she was my wife. She died many years ago, but she didn't die the way she was supposed to. She was taken. Taken? Lila repeated, confused. By the thing in the woods, Mr. Harold said, his voice trembling with fear. The creature that haunts this town. It feeds on souls, on the fear of the living. And when it takes someone, they don't die. They become part of it. Lila's stomach churned. You're saying she's still alive? Not alive, not in the way you understand, he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Her body is here, but her soul is trapped, twisted, part of the thing that haunts this town. And now it wants you. Lila's heart skipped a beat. Me? Mr. Harold nodded grimly. It knows you're here, Miss Lila. It knows you've uncovered the secret. And now it will come for you, just as it came for my wife. It feeds on fear. The smell of rot. When Nathaniel Graves received the letter, he thought it a curious joke. A mansion, a sprawling estate in the heart of a forgotten countryside, had been left to him by a relative he had never known existed. The letter was official enough, the seal genuine, but the name on the paper, Alistair Graves, meant nothing to him. Still, the allure of an inheritance, especially one so grand, was too tempting to ignore. He made his way to the mansion on a damp autumn afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The road leading to the estate was narrow and overgrown, the trees arching overhead like silent sentinels guarding the path. As Nathaniel approached the house, he could see that it was as imposing as it was ancient. The mansion stood in a clearing, surrounded by a vast, untended garden, its windows dark and vacant. The roof sagged in places, and the stone walls were covered in creeping ivy, as if the house itself was trying to hide from the world. The front door creaked loudly as Nathaniel pushed it open, and the smell hit him immediately. A thick, nauseating stench that seemed to cling to the air, heavy with the scent of decay. It was as though something had been rotting in the house for years, if not decades. The smell was so overwhelming that Nathaniel gagged, his stomach churning as he stepped inside. The interior was just as oppressive as the exterior. The grand foyer was shrouded in shadow, the walls lined with faded tapestries and portraits of grim-faced ancestors. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the air was thick with dust. Yet, despite the house's age and neglect, it felt alive, as though it were watching him, waiting. Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The letter had instructed him to explore the mansion and claim his inheritance, but it offered no further details. He had expected to find something of value, perhaps antique furniture, rare books, or priceless heirlooms, but he had not anticipated the suffocating sense of unease that clung to the place. As he moved further into the house, the smell grew stronger, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the mansion, a source that Nathaniel could not yet identify. The pungent odor twisted in his nostrils, making it hard to breathe. He felt his throat tighten and his eyes watered as he pressed on, determined to uncover the mystery of the mansion. The hallways seemed endless, winding in strange directions, each room more decrepit than the last. But it was when he reached the back of the house that he found something truly unsettling. A narrow staircase led down to a basement, the steps slick with moisture and covered in layers of grime. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as he descended, the air growing colder with each step. The smell of rot was unbearable now, suffocating, as though it were coming from the very walls themselves. It was a smell that clung to his skin, invaded his lungs, and made his mind reel. At the bottom of the stairs, Nathaniel found a door. It was small, tucked away in a corner, and it looked out of place in the otherwise grand mansion. The door was made of old, warped wood, its surface covered in deep scratches, as though something, or someone, had tried to claw its way out. The smell of decay was strongest here, and Nathaniel's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But something compelled him to open the door. The hinges groaned in protest as Nathaniel pushed the door open, revealing a hidden chamber. The room was small and dimly lit, the only light coming from a single, flickering candle on the floor. The air was thick with the stench of death, and Nathaniel could barely bring himself to step inside. But as he did, his eyes were drawn to the center of the room. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was a large, decaying object wrapped in a tattered cloth. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat as he approached it, his hands trembling. He reached out to touch the cloth, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp fabric. With a sudden burst of fear, he yanked the cloth away. What he saw beneath it made his blood run cold. A body, or what remained of one, lay before him. It was a grotesque, mummified figure, its skin stretched tight over brittle bones, its eyes hollow and sunken. The smell of decay was unbearable, and Nathaniel had to fight the urge to vomit as he stepped back. But it was not just the body that horrified him. It was the way it seemed to watch him. The eyes, though empty, seemed to follow his every movement, as if the corpse were still alive, still aware of his presence. Suddenly, the air in the room grew thick, and Nathaniel felt a presence behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger. His breath quickened, and his pulse raced as he took a step back. The unseen hand. Ever since moving into the old Victorian house on Oak Street, Henry had felt an unsettling sense of unease. The house was beautiful. Its high ceilings, grand windows, and intricate woodwork gave it an air of elegance and history. But something about it didn't sit right with him. At first, he chalked it up to the usual disorientation of a new home, the unfamiliar creaks of the floors, the strange way the wind howled through the chimneys. But as the days passed, the sense of discomfort deepened. It began subtly, small things that he could easily explain away. A chair out of place, a book missing from the shelf, a light turned off when he was certain he had left it on. At first, Henry assumed it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He was tired, adjusting to the new environment, perhaps even a little stressed. But then the occurrences became more frequent, more deliberate. One morning, he awoke to find the living room completely rearranged. The couch had been moved several feet from its usual spot, and the coffee table was now positioned at an odd angle. His favorite painting, which had always hung above the mantel, was now resting against the far wall, as though it had been moved in a hurry. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a mistake. Perhaps he had done it in his sleep, or maybe the house had settled overnight in some strange way. But as the days went on, the changes grew more pronounced, more invasive. One evening, after a long day at work, Henry returned home to find that his kitchen had been completely rearranged. The refrigerator had been moved, the dishes were stacked in unfamiliar places, and the countertops were bare. Where once there had been fruit, there was now nothing but an empty space. His heart began to race. He was certain he hadn't done any of this. He was alone in the house, and yet someone, or something, was tampering with his life. The next night, he stayed up late, watching the clock tick toward midnight. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive silence of the house. He tried to relax, tried to convince himself that he was simply imagining things, but the unease gnawed at him, growing with each passing minute. Suddenly, he heard it, a soft, scuffling sound from the hallway outside his bedroom. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly crept toward the door. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving around in the dark. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, the sound stopped. The next morning, Henry woke up to find his bed had been made, perfectly, as though he hadn't even slept in it. The sheets were smooth, the pillows fluffed, and his clothes had been neatly folded at the foot of the bed. He was certain he hadn't done any of this. He never made his bed. And yet, there it was, pristine and untouched. It wasn't just the bed. His entire house had been rearranged again. The furniture was moved, the curtains drawn, the kitchen reorganized. The small personal touches that had once given the house character, his books, his photos, were gone, replaced with strange, unfamiliar objects. His world was slowly being transformed into something unrecognizable. As the days wore on, the changes became more deliberate, more precise. It was as though something, or someone, was trying to take control of his life. His possessions were no longer just moved. They were placed in positions that made no sense, as though they were part of some twisted design. His shoes were lined up in perfect rows, his keys arranged in a circle on the kitchen table. It was as though an invisible hand was shaping his every move, manipulating his world from the shadows. The sense of being watched grew stronger. Henry began to feel as though he was no longer alone in the house, even when he was the only one there. He could hear footsteps in the halls, whispers in the walls, and the sound of something or someone breathing just behind him. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head, that he was losing his mind, but deep down, he knew the truth. One night, as he sat in the dark, staring at the empty space where his television used to be, Henry felt it, a cold, clammy hand resting on his shoulder. His blood ran cold as he turned, but there was no one there. Only the faintest trace of a shadow seemed to flicker in the corner of his eye. He jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, but when he looked around, the room was empty. In a panic, he grabbed his phone and dialed the number for a local paranormal investigator. But when the phone rang, it was as though the voice on the other end was familiar, too familiar. The voice that answered was his own, deep and distorted, as though it had been twisted by some unseen force. "Henry," the voice rasped. "You're not alone. You never were." The line went dead. The widow's grief. The town of Ashford was known for its quiet streets, its ivy-clad cottages, and the thick fog that rolled in from the moors every evening, cloaking the town in a ghostly silence. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change, where life moved slowly, and death was something that happened to others. But for Eleanor Carter, life had changed in an instant. Her husband, Thomas, had died suddenly, leaving her alone in their home. He had been a healthy man, full of life and energy. But one night, he simply didn't wake up. The doctors had no explanation, and the town had murmured in hushed tones, speculating about the cause of his death. Was it a heart attack, a stroke, or something more sinister? Eleanor, however, couldn't bring herself to believe it. She couldn't accept that her husband, the man she had loved for so many years, was gone. She spent her days in a haze of grief, her thoughts consumed by the memory of his warm smile, his gentle touch. But as the days passed, something strange began to happen. It started with the letter. It arrived on a cold morning. The paper yellowed and the ink smudged, as though it had been written in haste. Eleanor opened it, her hands trembling, only to find a message that made no sense. "I am not gone, Eleanor. Do not trust what you are told." At first she thought it was a cruel prank, some twisted joke played on her in her time of mourning. But as the days passed, more letters arrived, each one more cryptic than the last. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Thomas's. She recognized it from the many letters they had exchanged during their courtship and later their marriage. I am trapped, Eleanor. Find the key. It is in the attic. They are lying to you. I was not meant to die. You must trust no one. The truth is hidden in the walls. Each letter seemed to pull her deeper into a web of confusion and dread. Eleanor couldn't understand what was happening. How could Thomas be writing to her from beyond the grave? How could he be alive, or at least aware, when he had been buried in the cemetery just days before? The messages began to take on a more urgent tone. They spoke of a secret, a dark plan that had been set into motion long before Thomas's death. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of the letters. What was he trying to tell her? And why had he been so insistent that she find the truth? One night, unable to bear the weight of her grief and confusion any longer, Eleanor ventured into the attic. It was a place she had avoided since Thomas's death, as if the very air in that room carried the weight of his absence. But now, driven by the cryptic words of the letters, she felt compelled to search. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old trunks and forgotten belongings. Eleanor's heart pounded as she sifted through the dust-covered boxes, her hands trembling with anticipation. She was searching for something, but she didn't know what. The key, the truth, something that would make sense of the madness that had taken over her life. And then she found it. At the bottom of an old trunk, hidden beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, Eleanor uncovered a small, ornate box. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. She held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, and for a moment she hesitated. What was this? Was this the key Thomas had mentioned? With a sense of foreboding, she opened the box. Inside there was a single yellowed piece of paper. It was a note, written in Thomas's handwriting. But the words on it were not what she expected. They were not words of love or reassurance, but of fear. They have taken me, Eleanor, the ones who promised me eternal life. They have bound me to this place, and I am no longer your Thomas. Do not try to bring me back. You must leave before it is too late. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she read the words over and over again. What was he talking about? Who were they? What had happened to Thomas? Her mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. The strange messages, the cryptic letters, none of it made sense until now. Thomas's death had not been a natural one. He had been part of something dark, something that involved forces beyond her understanding. The truth was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. As she stood there holding the note in her trembling hands, a cold gust of wind swept through the attic, extinguishing the candle she had been holding. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she heard a whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a voice she recognized. Eleanor, it's not over. Come to me. The voice was Thomas's, but it was different now, hollow and distorted, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, from a place that was not of this world. Eleanor's heart raced as she fumbled for the matches to relight the candle, but before she could strike one. The last breath. Samantha had never planned to be here. The house, nestled at the edge of the forest, had always been a place of whispers among the locals, a place that was best avoided. But when her car broke down on the desolate road one rainy evening, she had no choice but to seek refuge in the dilapidated structure. The rain had been relentless, and the wind howled like some ancient creature longing to escape its prison. She had knocked on the door, unsure of what to expect, but the man who answered seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't place why. He was old, frail, his face pale and gaunt as though he had not seen the light of day in years. His name was Edgar, he explained in a raspy voice, and he welcomed her inside with an unsettling urgency. His eyes darted around nervously, as though he were expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a host," Edgar had said, his voice quivering. "But you're welcome to stay until the storm passes." Samantha, though uneasy, had little choice but to accept. The house was cold, the air thick with dust, and the scent of something old and decaying. The walls creaked and groaned as though they were alive, shifting with the weight of secrets that had been buried long ago. Edgar led her to a small room, the dim light of a flickering lamp casting long shadows across the walls. He seemed to be struggling to breathe, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. His hand trembled as he gestured for her to sit, but he did not join her. Instead, he walked slowly to the far corner of the room, where a large, ornate mirror hung on the wall. "I haven't much time," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You must leave before it's too late." Samantha, confused and anxious, asked what he meant, but Edgar only shook his head, his eyes wide with a terror she couldn't understand. "It's not just me," he muttered, his voice breaking. "The house, it breathes, it's alive and it's waiting." Before she could respond, Edgar collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Panic surged through her as she rushed to his side, but it was clear that he was beyond help. His skin was clammy, his eyes glazed over as though he were already slipping away from the world. She tried to call for help, but the phone line was dead, the storm outside howling louder than ever. As Edgar's breath grew shallower, something strange began to happen. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, as though the very space itself was suffocating. Samantha's own breath became labored, and she felt an oppressive weight on her chest, as though something was pressing down on her from all sides. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching and contorting as if alive. Her heart raced, and her mind spun with confusion and fear. It was then that she noticed something horrifying. Edgar's breath, his last, labored breaths, were not the only ones in the room. There was another sound, a faint, rhythmic inhaling and exhaling, coming from somewhere deeper within the house. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the sound, and Samantha's skin prickled with a chilling sense of dread. She stood, her legs weak beneath her, and looked around the room, her eyes darting to every corner. The breathing was coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air itself. It was as if the house itself was alive, its breath mingling with Edgar's final gasps. Samantha stumbled backward, her mind racing with terror. She tried to leave the room, but the door would not open. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with every breath. The house was alive, just as Edgar had warned, and it was hungry. The breathing grew louder, more frantic, as though the house was drawing in the last of Edgar's life force. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though they were breathing in time with the man's fading life. It was then that Samantha realized the horrifying truth. The house was feeding on him, on his life, on his breath. She turned, desperate to escape, but the mirror in the corner of the room had changed. It no longer reflected her own image, but instead showed the room as it had once been, a place of life and warmth, with a family gathered around a hearth. But the family was not whole. There was something in the background, something moving in the shadows. And then, in the reflection, Samantha saw the shape of a figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The breathing, now frantic and erratic, grew louder, as though it were coming from every direction. Samantha's chest tightened, her lungs burning as if they could no longer draw air. The house was suffocating her, consuming her, just as it had consumed Edgar. In her panic, she glanced back at the dying man. His eyes were wide open now, his body stiffening. The monster in the attic. David had always been close to his younger brother, Thomas. Growing up, they shared everything: secrets, dreams, and even their fears. But when Thomas disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing behind but a few scattered belongings and a cryptic note, David's world was turned upside down. Desperate for answers, he scoured the town, questioned everyone who might know something, and even turned to the police, but all in vain. It was as if Thomas had vanished into thin air. The note, the only clue left behind, was brief and unsettling. "I've found it. Don't come looking for me." David couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, that his brother had uncovered something that had cost him dearly. One night, after months of fruitless searching, David returned to the family home. The house was old, creaking under the weight of time, its once welcoming facade now dark and foreboding. He hadn't been back since Thomas's disappearance, but something in his gut told him that the answers lay within those walls. The house was quiet, too quiet. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of neglect. David made his way upstairs, each step on the wooden floorboards echoing in the stillness. His eyes scanned the familiar rooms, but everything seemed different now, darker, as if the house itself had changed in his absence. He paused outside Thomas's bedroom, his hand hovering over the doorknob, but something stopped him. He had already searched the room countless times. It wasn't there. The answers lay elsewhere. His gaze shifted to the attic door at the end of the hallway. It had always been locked, an area of the house they had never ventured into as children. Their parents had warned them to stay away from it, but the curiosity had always gnawed at them. Now, David felt an undeniable pull toward it, a sense that the attic held the key to everything: his brother's disappearance, the strange feeling that had settled over him, and the growing sense of dread that seemed to permeate the house. He grabbed the old rusted key from the drawer and turned it in the lock. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into the darkness. A musty smell wafted down, thick and suffocating. David hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped forward, the wooden steps groaning under his weight as he ascended. The attic was a vast, cluttered space, filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten relics of the past. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like tattered curtains, and the air was thick with dust. As David moved deeper into the attic, his flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. He swept the beam across the room, scanning the clutter for any sign of his brother. And then, in the far corner of the room, something caught his eye. A large wooden chest sat against the wall, its surface covered in layers of dust. It was out of place, as if it had been recently moved. David's heart began to race. He approached the chest cautiously, his breath shallow, and knelt beside it. The lid was slightly ajar, as if it had been opened recently, though no one had been in the attic for years. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a collection of old, tattered books, strange symbols drawn on their covers. But what really caught his attention was the shape that lay beneath them. A dark, hulking form, curled up and motionless. David's pulse quickened as he realized what he was seeing. It wasn't a pile of old clothes or a forgotten relic. It was a creature, its body twisted and malformed, its skin pale and mottled, like the flesh of something long dead. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in sharp, clawed fingers. The creature's face was hidden in shadow, but David could see the faint outline of its eyes that glowed with an unnatural, predatory light. A cold shiver ran down David's spine. He reached out, instinctively pulling back when his fingers brushed the creature's hide. It was warm, too warm. The thing in the chest was alive. Before he could react, the creature stirred, its eyes snapping open, glowing with an ancient hunger. David stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The thing let out a low, guttural growl, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It was hungry, and David was its prey. In that moment, the creature lunged, faster than David could react. Its claws raked across his arm, sending a searing pain through his body. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the creature was too strong. It dragged him toward the chest, its grip like iron, its breath hot and rancid against his skin. David fought back, using every ounce of strength to break free, but the creature's grip only tightened. It hissed, its teeth bared, and for a moment, David saw something familiar in its eyes, something that made his blood run cold. It was Thomas. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His brother hadn't disappeared.